Judicial review has been in the news recently, and Dan did a really good video about the Rwanda appeal. But what is judicial review? So I thought I'd just do like a little overview. Um, Essentially, judicial review is a mechanism by which the courts can supervise decisions of public bodies. One thing to understand is the courts do not comment on the decision itself. They merely look at how the decision was arrived at. Uh, so first of all, what do we mean by public body? Well, obviously that's the government. Government departments can include things like the police and the CPS. Basically, any organisation that fulfils a public function. So that can be like licensing committees, planning committees. It can also include some what we call NGOs, non-government organisations. But if they have a power to sort of conduct public life, one thing it doesn't cover is private associations, because there's been a couple of cases like with the Jockey Club and the British Boxing Board of Control, where people have argued they're public bodies because effectively you can only horse race under the auspices of the Jockey Club, and you can only box under the auspices of the British Boxing Board of Control. But the courts have said, well, yeah, but they are private members' organisations, and theoretically there's nothing to stop you setting up your own horse racing scheme or boxing scheme. And indeed there are a number of boxing organisations around the world, aren't there? So organisations like that don't count, even though arguably they do sort of interfere with your right to work and exist in public, etc., etc. Who can bring such a claim? Who has standing? Well, that's somebody who is affected by the decision. Now, that could be you're personally affected. Say for instance, you're having a row with the Department of Work and Pensions about a benefit, or something like that, or with the planning committee. That's affecting you personally. But also they've expanded what we call standing now. So, like annoying hippies like myself who, like trees like these, and animals. If a decision affects, say, I'm going to chop down a load of trees or something, then organisations or people with a specific interest in that, they have been given standing. So it's back to my, sort of personhood for non-humans thing. Effectively, the trees or the relevant animals don't have personhood, but somebody is allowed to bring a claim. It's not really on their behalf because they're bringing the claim in their own name, but they are effectively bringing the claim, on behalf of the trees or the animals. The court can only, like I say, it looks at the decision-making process. And what it's checking is that the body is operating within the rules. Now, ultimately, Parliament is sovereign. Parliament can pass any laws that it wants. But when it comes to exercising those laws, the courts have a supervisory jurisdiction. So it can be something like, to give a trite example, the law says a particular benefit is X pounds per fortnight, and they don't give you that. Well, they're just acting outside the law. It's what we call ultra vires, beyond the powers. Or it might be that an organisation just doesn't have any authority to make that particular decision. Usually, though, it's accepted that, the decision, they were entitled to make a decision on that subject, but they've done it wrong. And that can be something like they have taken into account a factor that they shouldn't have taken into account. Or they've not taken into account a factor they should have taken into account. Or they just apply a general policy. They don't look at things on a case-by-case basis. Or the decision is just what we call Wednesbury unreasonable. Wednesbury was a case that sort of, set this test out. And the test just isn't that they get a decision that people disagree with. It's a decision that no reasonable decision maker could have made. So this crops up a lot, like with appeals and things. The test isn't, well, we'd have done something different. It's, were you entitled to do what you actually did? And that's a very, very wide discretion. Courts are very reluctant to interfere. Also, there are general human rights challenges because, you know, human rights is part of English law. So if a decision breaches one of your sort of convention rights, then that can be a ground for judicial review. But like I say, courts are very reluctant to do this. Because what they're actually saying is they're not saying we disagree with the policy or we disagree with what you've done. They're just saying you have made a decision that's not in accordance with your own rules. And, you know, and as quite often happens, the government go, okay, then we'll just change the law to bring it within the rules. Judicial review, very strict time limit. You've got to bring the claim within 3 months of the decision, or actually 6 weeks if it's a planning decision. And you have to get permission or leave to bring a judicial review. So there's 2 hearings. There's the application for leave to bring the review, and then there is actually the review itself. Sometimes they will do what they call rolled up hearings, where it will say, list it, you know, leave to appeal application with appeal to follow, application to bring judicial review with the full hearing to be straight away if permission is granted. So that's usually a good sign, actually. That's usually well, we think you might be okay on this one. And sometimes you'll do all the argument in the permission hearing and they go, yes, you have permission to bring judicial review. What do you say now? And say, well, just what we've just said. What can the courts do? They can't substitute their own decision. All they can effectively say is, we quash this decision, or we just make a declaration that that decision was unlawful, go away and do something about it. But Parliament, you know, the government, they can pretty much do anything they want because ultimately they are sovereign. So if they want to, if they say, well, you've done this not in accordance with the rules, they can say, well, we'll go and change the rules then. With domestic legislation, that's fairly easy. So, you know, if, for instance, they say you're applying the sort of pensions regime incorrectly or the tax regime or the planning regime, they can say, well, we'll just change our own tax or pension or planning law. If it's something that's international, though, you know, governments sign treaties and conventions with, you know, international as part of the international community. What the courts there say is, well, there's this idea that Parliament never legislates in breach of its treaty obligations. So if there is a treaty or a convention that the government, or sorry, the country has signed up to, they say, well, we will assume that you actually meant that, and therefore you are bound by the rules in that treaty. But there's nothing to stop somebody pulling out of a treaty. And we've heard about people, you know, pulling out, you know, considering pulling out of like the European Convention on Human Rights, or the Refugee Convention or something like that. I mean, there is nothing to stop a government doing that, as we've said, because they are sovereign. But that's pretty much it. So it is a tool that people can use on a personal level. Yeah? Oh, excuse me. Just to interject, I was actually filming that in an old abandoned church at a place called Merthyr. And that was the very nice landowner just pointing out that I was inside a collapsing church. And also the big signs up saying this is about to collapse, and there was a big fence around it. I actually had to admit that I knew I was in a collapsing church, so he just rolled his eyes a little bit. But anyway, I survived, and here we are. And I did actually just do a little bit of an end to that, so back to our scheduled programming. That was somebody pointing out that I've actually stood inside a church that is about to collapse, and it's probably a really bad place to stand. So, to wrap up there, but that's the sort of dedication I, you know, do to bring you interesting and nice places. But I think we've covered everything there, so if you did like that, please consider liking, sharing, subscribing, etc. Now, I'm going to try and climb out of this building without it collapsing on me. See you next time, hopefully.